My job is to talk a little bit about CR 1998. I should preface everything I say that by kind of demystifying what it meant at that time to be part of the organizing collective. I saw myself, and I very much was an amateur, a rookie, and a student. I was a glorified envelope licker. I was an errand runner. During the conference, I helped shuttle things back and forth. I dealt with conflicts, and I was studying as I moved. I learned that was my real graduate school education, I have to say, was the 2 years I spent working on CR, learning from people like Ruthie, like Angela, like Dorsey Nunn, all these folks. So that's been instructive for me from, really it'll be instructive for me for the rest of my life. I entered this work as a student, I exited as a student. By this, I mean, I remain a student of all the movements, campaigns, organizations, contradictions that constituted critical resistance in 1998 and thereafter. So let me talk about a couple of things. The first thing is both basic, but not basic, because I think it was actually a radical maneuver. The first CR conference pushed legal advocacy, criminal justice policy, rights-based reform frameworks and labors, I think toward a pretty collective acknowledgement that the system was actually not broken, nor was it corrupt, but instead that it was actually working more or less as it was logically structured and politically intended to work. That was profound, and it clearly affected how people who had nothing to do with what we would now call abolitionist praxis entered what was a proto-abolitionist collective. There was a real kind of existential and political crisis for a number of people, but sharing that kind of conflict and misery, and there's a lot of frustration all the time from precisely the crowd of folks who had at that point literally spent their entire adult lives trying to fix a fucked up system. What they saw as being a corrupted and fixable system, realizing it actually was not that. The thing that moved me as a participant and student of everything that I was watching was kind of experiencing and hearing how it was that people talked about the targeted, gendered, racist incarceration and criminalization of poor, vulnerable Black and brown people as a systemic way to make state violence a solution to the wealth of post-industrial crises of racism, capitalism, et cetera, at the limits of Jim Crow, of post-Jim Crow civil rights struggle. It completely altered my whole paradigm of how to do political work. So that was one thing. Was it kind of gathered this sense, I would say not a sense, a sensibility that the system was not broken, that it was working as it was intended to work. The second thing I wanted to emphasize, because I think it's been a lasting contribution to kind of the larger political work of the world, was CR 1998 was I realized it was a public pedagogy. It was about circulating and popularizing an accessible critical rhetoric. It was about constructing, in a dynamic way now, constructing an analytical framework for the thing we were calling the prison industrial complex. People forget, I think at times, nowadays, that at that time, prison industrial complex was still a relatively new phrase. It wasn't this kind of commonly using, and most importantly for me now, it meant something very different than the phrase mass incarceration, right? So I have a whole polemic about mass incarceration I won't get into, but this concept of prison industrial complex was deep and it was meaningful. And again, what it suggested was that rather than being corrupt, dysfunctional, or broken, this whole kind of set of institutions and regimes that constituted policing, criminalization, and incarceration was in fact working as it was designed to work. So I'll say that this kind of pedagogical, rhetorical, analytical work that CR 98 did became the condition of possibility for what eventually has become the reemergence, I think, and the resurgence, really, of an abolitionist praxis over the last over the following 5 to 10 years. It became speakable. This notion of abolition became speakable once again, and it's on the back of all this work that people were doing around CR 98. The third thing I want to speak to was there was a sense of intimacy. Unlike anything I ever experienced or have really experienced this with rare exceptions, and I can talk about that later, but CR 10 was also very intimate, and there's another conference I'll talk about later that was also, very intimate. But there was an intimacy of what Ruthie was calling this convergence. It was elders, it was survivors of all kinds, survivors of different forms of violence, particularly of carceral violence. I mean, there were people that were there, unacknowledged U.S. political prisoners, prisoners of war. There were young people, students. There were burned out nonprofit activists. There were faith and religious community folks. There were regular old people. There was homeless people. But there was an intimacy that constructed this environment that I think was part of the politics and the analysis. In other words, I don't say that as a kind of just as a feel good statement, but it did feel good, right? It felt good to be in the room with people who shared this intimacy with this, not just with the violence and the survival, but with this sense that we had to do something, that something had to be done, that this was a moment in which there was no option but to undertake perhaps more radical and more militantly radical thinking, maneuvers, and organizing. The fourth thing I'll say, this once again was another lesson to me during this period of time in the latter 90s, that the most radical shit going on was led by feminists, queer, and people of color. And usually they were all the above, right? So I was following the lead of feminist and queer leadership, and in the presence of a cross-generation feminist and queer leadership. So I think CR 98 signified this kind of cross-generational practice and organizing practice that introduced a bunch of contradictions and debates. So don't get me wrong, I don't mean to romanticize it, but I do want to say that it demystified and it kind of, I think, departed from some of the really narrow depictions of how radical US-based organizing has worked, particularly if it's anti-racist, right? That it's kind of masculinist, led by men, there's grandstanding kind of bullshit like that. It wasn't like that at all. And it was instructive. And again, it changed how I thought it did pretty much everything. And the last thing I really feel obligated to emphasize in CR 98 was, and I don't think I appreciated it fully at the time, although I was deeply affected by it, but I've appreciated it in it's been 20 years. Can you believe that? So it's been 20 years since. The visibility, the foregrounding, the leadership, and by leadership, I don't just mean leadership by kind of example and iconic presence. I mean organizing leadership. I mean intellectual leadership of formerly incarcerated survivors of state violence. I'll never forget that folks that were there, and some currently incarcerated people at the time as well, folks that were there signified what it meant to be survivors and people still engaged in domestic war. So it meant that this practice that became an abolitionist praxis necessarily engaged that group of folks, that they were front and center, and that they were some of the folks that were actually making it possible to think this way. And I'll stop there.